That's probably good enough. Okay.
Cool.
So hello again, everybody. I was here a little bit earlier. Sorry for like bothering your feeds even more. I am here today with Chelsea de Souza. I guess let me give a rundown of who she is kind of first. I met her at my church gig through St. Peter United. She plays organ there, but that is not her actual main instrument, right? You are a pianist. That's correct, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Currently, she is a doctoral student, right? DMA at Rice.
Mm-hmm.
Are you studying performance or pedagogy?
Performance, yeah.
Okay.
My first year there, yeah.
Very cool. Well, today I'm just going to talk to Chelsea about classical music and kind of get her thoughts and just try to, see what we can find. So first off, I really just want to talk about like the role of the piano in classical music and kind of how that's maybe has evolved a little bit. Whenever my students first think of classical music, it's all just kind of like, they all think of just somebody playing a piano in like a background at a fancy party or something. Most of them actually all recognize Chopin. None of them, hardly any of them, know any Liszt music. Actually, they all recognize the Moonlight Sonata.
Yeah.
And so like that's kind of their only real experience with this stuff, and really until this class. So, what can you explain as far as like the role of the piano in like classical music? And that's a very open-ended question, but go.
Well, so there are a couple things like happening at this time period, right, in the 17th, 18th century. So suddenly like printing music has become really important. So all of a sudden composers are, they can expand their output, and not just that, they can get it out to the people, like the middle class.
Right.
And so now we have these salon gatherings. So if you think of like what was happening, in parallel like literature for like Jane Austen, for example,
sure.
Like Pride and Prejudice, they would have these parties, and the ladies who their moms were trying to show them off, and they would sit at the piano and play a little sonata by Mozart. And so these composers were getting their income, not from like a king who was employing them in their court, but now it's like from selling their music to anyone who could play the piano. So, pretty much every middle class home had a piano in it, and the piano kind of became this central form of music making during the classical period.
Right. So like with the piano itself, it comes from like the harpsichord, right? The sort of one keyboard kind of comes from the next one, and these pianos, they were much different than a harpsichord, right? Because first off, well, piano, right, isn't like the actual name of this thing, right? It's actually the piano forte, as far as like I was taught, at least.
Well, so it's interesting. So at the time period we're talking about, like Haydn and Mozart, they played something called the forte piano.
Oh, so the other way around.
So what we have now is called a piano forte, the large black instrument that you see on stage. But actually, even before that came about, so that kind of started to become popular, Beethoven, Chopin, and later. And early classical period, we're talking about the forte piano. So it's it's in between the harpsichord and the piano. And it's a little softer, but it's not as like jangly, as the harpsichord. And it's starting to sustain more, and the range is expanding. And you're getting a lot more colors in it that are similar to our modern piano.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So wait, why was it the forte piano first? Was it just because like...
No, I don't know what made what caused the name to change from forte piano to the piano forte. But when it first came out, the forte piano, they called it that because it suddenly was able to do a much larger range of volumes, forte and piano, which the harpsichord couldn't do.
Right, the harpsichord was just like stuck at that one, that one volume.
And
that was it.
The interesting things with the harpsichord were more like the colors that came from the strings they used.
Right. So I guess with like the difference then between the harpsichord and piano, that's kind of why the harpsichord, when we hear it, it's always kind of like rolling those like chords and stuff. It's never really like playing a sustained thing.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and so because of that, the style of music that's written during this time completely changes. There's a lot less ornamentation, and it becomes more restrained, and it becomes more about melody with accompaniment.
Right. in some, what was I reading? Some textbook along the way, it talks about C.P. Ebach and like one
Mm-hmm.
of his sort of like visions of aesthetic in music. He
Yeah.
thought that things needed to be more simple, a little bit more plain, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to like what his dad was doing. That whole like,
Right. All the counterpoint.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The spitting the melody,
Yeah.
the Fortspannung.
Right.
But yeah, so would it be safe to say that like because of like the invention of these like the piano and sort of the more technology, more availability of like information and whatnot, this had an impact on the music that was being like made at that time?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it goes hand in hand, like what the shortcomings that composers and musicians felt in the instruments they played, they would probably mention those to piano makers, and there was more experimentation happening.
Yeah,
And I think
right.
that's like pretty characteristic of the time. There's a lot of like these salon gatherings and discussions about how music should be.
Yeah. Well, right.
How do
right.
we make music in its ideal form?
Right. And didn't that come from that sort of like French, like this French aesthetic?
Rousseau, yeah.
Yeah. Right. So what was it? King Louis, the Sun King. I can't remember which one he was. This King Louis, one of the Louis, but like I just remember reading about how like he had this specific idea of like beauty in music, and like how it needed to be like a very specific way, particularly for him, so he could like dance to it. I guess that was his thing.
Right. And that's why it's called, the classical period, because this is a problem that we have with the terminology for this music, right?
Right,
it's
right.
we have this period called the classical period, but we also call all of this music,
Right.
from Baroque to like modern classical
Exactly.
music. But it's called the classical period because of this sense of classicism, right? How do we go back to the roots of what makes music natural and ideal?
Right. And all of that definitely stems, I think, from that whole like that Enlightenment thing that was happening during that time. Just these sort of new philosophies, new ways of like looking. Well, maybe not new, right? But they were sort of rediscovering ways of looking at all this stuff. Right. Something that I think is like really fascinating from this time is how like symmetrical everything becomes. Especially in terms of art, it's like these old ideas kind of have this massive resurgence, and it just creates this order out of this weird sort of like chaotic soup that kind of came before it, and
right.
it seems that like throughout each era of music, things kind of get more and more like tighter in a way. It's things are starting to take more of a shape and a direction to it.
Yeah, I think definitely the classical period is the start of that. They're thinking a lot more about structure and form, right? So how do we make things balanced, not just at the small phrase level, but also in, over the whole piece. And so because of this, pieces also get longer, like Beethoven symphonies all of a sudden are just like double and triple the length of anything that came before.
Yeah, right. That's also really fascinating too, I think. So I had a conversation a couple of days ago just about form with a saxophone player, and we kind of came to this conclusion also that like Beethoven's music is a little perverse in a way. It's like he's taking these norms and just ripping them apart and seeing like what they can possibly do. And in a way, I think that's why like Beethoven's music like lasted for so long, and like why it was so important during its time too. So okay, I just want to talk a little bit now, like what are some of your favorite pieces kind of in this era? As a pianist, sort of what are your favorite pieces to play, and what are some pieces that you just enjoy if listening to, if at all?
So I gotta tell you, when I was young and I was like getting more into the piano, the classical period was probably my least favorite period of music to play, because I just thought it was so boring.
Yeah, right. Oh, I understand.
Yeah, because in a way, it just feels very predictable. It's
exactly.
A tonality that we're used to, and the phrases just proceed in a way that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
And,
it's,
so when you're young, that just feels like, okay.
Yeah, right. This is what we do. I remember when I was teaching piano lessons, it just those little pieces, man. they're great little tools, I think, for like just
Yes.
educational purposes,
Mhm.
because they all have like leading tones, they all sort of follow
Right.
the same rules of harmony,
Right.
and like it draws your ear to a very certain point, and
Yeah.
it's like you know where the end is, right? And
Yes,
the adventure is
exactly.
kind of how you get there,
Yeah.
but it's we've also been listening to the same stuff like 300 years, so it's like,
Absolutely. And
okay.
that's part of it. But I do remember when I started to find this kind of music more exciting. And it was after I sort of put myself in the context of those people and when they listened to it,
Yeah,
So
yeah.
for them, it was, Beethoven was definitely groundbreaking for them.
Sure.
Mozart and Haydn, maybe not so groundbreaking, but it just fit into their whole way of life, this sort of order and symmetry and like the social
Right.
classes. And so, like Mozart operas were groundbreaking in their own way, because all of a sudden he was bringing in this focus on, the servant characters.
Yeah, right.
And so they were all really interesting, way more interesting than their rulers.
Yeah, exactly.
And they did all these like funny things and played pranks. And, the audiences loved that.
Right.
Which for us is not a big deal, but, for them it was.
For them, that's groundbreaking, because it's in a way, Mozart is sort of poking fun at the aristocracy, and like who did that, like, whoa.
Yeah.
I remember, what was it? The Barber of Seville and the Marriage of Figaro.
Marriage of Figaro is a big one, yeah.
Yeah, so the Marriage of Figaro, the story, right, was the sequel to the Barber of Seville, but the Marriage of Figaro itself, I think, it got banned in Vienna or something. Like the censors, they were like, not a good idea, it's making too much fun of the aristocracy, or just like pointing out some really kind of things,
Right.
And but Mozart was such like a powerhouse composer that his publishers were like, no, we have to turn this into an opera. Like, it has to be an opera.
He was so famous, at that point, because he'd been traveling since a young kid. He'd been traveling all over Europe with his dad, playing concerts. He was this child prodigy.
I've always likened his life to kind of like Michael Jackson in a way. It's like I feel like it's very parallel, or there's a lot of parallels there. Because like you said, he was traveling at a very young age. He's playing for like basically all the nobility, anybody who mattered, and like they were essentially the celebrities of the time.
Right, and he was really pushed into doing that, and a really rigorous tour schedule.
Yeah, it's kind of sad in a way when you really like look into it,
Right.
And like clearly it had an effect on the way that he like lived. Of
course, I mean, he was like a star that burned so brightly for such a short time.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a very good way of putting it. One thing I always talk about is like, Mozart. He was one of the first guys to kind of break away from the sort of working for a family tradition,
Yes.
And that's also part of why, like, he sees a lot of success early on, and then his later life is just kind of like not musically. It was an extremely successful point in his career, I think, because he writes like some of the most epic things, but like, financially, like he was not doing so hot by that point.
He didn't know how to manage his finances, which Haydn was really good at that. Haydn really knew how to balance like the demands of the public and the patronage that he was still getting. And so, Haydn lives an amazing long life.
Right.
And immense output.
Yeah. Right. What was it? Haydn basically sees Mozart and Beethoven, doesn't he? Like he like teaches Beethoven for a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he teaches both of them. Yeah. It's also kind of amazing. I think all of these composers, they definitely sound, so different, but it's like they all came from one another in terms of their lineage.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think that's really interesting because, like, they were all writing in the same style, right? Yeah. Stylistically, they were all doing the same thing, but they found just vastly different ways of like doing this stuff, I once had a teacher, explain the difference between Mozart and Haydn. Haydn was like a really well-timed, very highbrow, like Monty Python-esque type joke, right? Yeah. And Mozart just came into a room and farted. And like, so to me, that has always like summed them up so much, and like, the music of Mozart, in a way, it's like, it's so just crass, it's like, it's so just, it's exposed, and like, there's like clearly something there, and it's like, maybe it's something you don't really want to see, but it's, I've always loved Mozart for that reason. And like, again, with Haydn, it's like, it's all in the details of everything, you know?
Right. It's refined witticism.
Yeah, right,
and Mozart
right.
can do that. He just,
of course.
There's stuff like that in his music, but I just think it's such a childlike sort of
right. It's very playful.
Joy. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. You know, and then again, Beethoven just kind of comes along and smashes all the windows.
Right.
Just breaks all the pianos.
And the interesting thing is, like, you know, I see so much confluence in Beethoven as a person and Beethoven as the composer, right? I mean, they're influencing each other, and because Beethoven had such a turbulent life,
right?
You know, it's not surprising to see that he was constantly trying to push boundaries in the music he was writing.
Right. You know, I think with Beethoven, as far as like many history books that I've read have kind of been concerned, I guess it's like, you know, Beethoven is really the first guy to really try to, maybe not try, but just really like infuse his music with just this mass amount of emotion. You know, there's this massive emotional pull in everything that he writes, you know, even like his earlier stuff, it's like clearly he's trying to do something, you know. I feel like with his earlier works, it's like he's like trying to prove something, and then kind of he realizes like what it is he's trying to do, and then like that deaf point kind of happens, and it's just like all bets are off, you know, like whatever I hear just goes on the page. And
well, I think his first period is very clearly he's absorbing the traditions of you know, Haydn and Mozart and the masters who came before him. He's sort of synthesizing all of it, and we already see like an expansion of form. But it's not quite like what we see in his later period, where he's fully absorbed, and you know, now he's putting his own stamp on it, and he's doing completely different stuff with it. Right.
So the example that I always use in my class is the Eighth Sonata, right? The one in C minor. I never say the name right. Is it
Pathétique?
The Pathétique, yeah. And you know, I always try to like narrate it a lot, like with my class as we're listening, and just like that opening grave section that comes back, you know, it's like to me, I just imagine that the first time people were hearing that, you know, they're just like, what is happening right now? You know, it's like this is the first movement of a sonata, right? Why am I like? Why is it not like in my face, you know? And then it's just
joyful like you expect it to be.
Yeah, exactly. You know,
and you know, if you think about it, at that time, like it's in the key of C minor, right? And at that time, keys really had significance. In terms of the emotion. And C minor is a really important key for Beethoven. It's like true pathos, you know, the Pathétique Sonata and all the other ones too that he wrote in C minor. Like the C minor concerto too is like it's got this gravity to it.
Yeah, everything that he does in C minor has like a heavy weight to it. That was one of, as far as I know, that was one of his like favorite keys. You know, I mean, he writes in it so many. Was it the Fifth Symphony, right? That's C minor, the first movement. It's just
the blows of fate.
Exactly. Everyone knows that, you know. That's what I use in my class as an example of a motive, you know.
And his E flat major ones, you know, the relative major, those are the triumphant ones. You know, the heroic pieces.
That's really interesting. So it's almost like those two keys are like the antithesis of each other or something in a way, you know, like it's like
I can totally see that.
I don't know. I need to delve more into Beethoven. I haven't really thought about this stuff since
I find Beethoven so fascinating because one of my favorite pieces from the classical era, to go back to your original question. It's his penultimate sonata. So he wrote 32 sonatas, and this is number 31. It's an A flat major, and I've been playing it a lot recently because this is the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. So and I think it's Beethoven, I mean, almost everyone knows Beethoven struggled with, you know, becoming deaf during his life. And, you know, by the time he was in his 40s, he'd like completely stopped performing in public. He'd stopped conducting, although he was still composing. And you can see this, you know, influence in his music. And he wrote these letters called the Heiligenstadt Testament to his brothers, where he talks about, you know, having suicidal thoughts because he doesn't know how he's going to keep living as a musician who's losing his hearing, right? But then, you know, he ends those letters with this sense of hopefulness. He's like, I'm going to keep living because I feel like I have something really important to say with my music. And in this, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that reminds me of like, you know, in the Ninth Symphony, right, when he like
Mm-hmm.
just includes that random prayer like at the end of it, you know, and it's just
Yeah.
like the gravity of that, you know, and it's just like what was the translation of it? Oh geez, I can't remember it. But it was like, it was something kind of like, it was really like uplifting in a way, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
like it's just after this massive, just Beethoven-esque heavy piece of music, you know, there's just this prayer like at the end of
Right.
it, you know, and it's like whoa.
Right, it's breathtaking. And I mean, I don't know if Beethoven was, you know, a spiritual guy,
Sure.
but it just sounds so spiritual. And this sonata in
Yeah.
particular, the A flat major, like the first movement, you know, this beautiful lush A flat major, and then he goes into this like aria and fugue, right? So the aria is this, it's incredibly sad, it's B flat minor and just like pathos,
Yeah.
and then this fugue sort of emerges out of the aria in a major key, D flat major.
Whoa.
And it sort of, it blooms kind of, and I just feel like it has this most uplifting sense of like the struggle from darkness into light. And I think this like darkness into light transition is very characteristic, especially of Beethoven's late stuff.
Right. I totally agree with that. You know, it's, again, it's just, it's this idea of like everything is so heavy, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been working with this sort of concept of like pitch, I guess, as like color,
Yeah.
right? You know, we get basically 12 primary colors in music, right? And like
Yeah.
octave equivalencies are just lighter and darker shades of those
Right.
colors, essentially, you know? And thinking in terms of like timbre, I guess, it's really affected the way that I perceive, you know, just like symphonic works.
Yeah.
And, you know, but even like solo instrument works, the different timbres that can be achieved out of an instrument, you know, I think it has a lot to do with the way that we sort of interpret these pieces now. And it really has an effect just, I feel like on the construction of these pieces initially, you know, because like granted, Beethoven would not have had a piano that we have today, correct?
No, not quite. Yeah, it was not yet, but it's more like the pianos we have today than anything that came before it. And I looking back now at my piano lessons, I always remember teachers telling me, you know, with Mozart and Haydn, they would always say, "Oh, don't go too hard because, you know, their pianos would not have been able to do that." But with Beethoven, even though his piano was different, it was almost like Beethoven could imagine the future of the piano and he wrote for it, you know? His music just goes to the absolute outer extremes, and it's like he wants to go even further than the range he had. You know, so as a modern pianist, Beethoven is like the first classical composer where you feel like you can really dig in and sort of use the resonance of the modern piano for the music.
That's awesome. So, you know, one thing that I talk to my class about also is like Beethoven's sort of upbringing was a little bit similar to Mozart's in the sense that like his dad kind of made him play piano for like people at an early age, you know, he was going on tour and whatnot. But like Beethoven was different than Mozart because he like rebelled quite a bit, you know, like he was not really into the style that was kind of happening, you know. And I love the stories about how he would like break pianos, you know. That was like
he's said to have, you know, a fiery temper, would yell at his servants for disturbing him while he was composing and like that. Oh yeah, it was just, you know, I mean, you can see it in his music, right? His music is so much more, I think the changes in character happen a lot more suddenly and a lot more extreme than Mozart. Even though Mozart does have sudden switches of character, it always feels a little more restrained.
Exactly. Well, yeah, cool, man. So I totally lost my spot. Here we go. So I guess your favorite piece here was the A flat major sonata, correct? The number 31.
31.
So, you know, most of what I know of you, I guess, as a performer is like, you just kind of sit back and like hang out on the organ playing a chord, right? But like I've seen some of your videos, and you know the Janacek Sonata, like I absolutely love that piece, man.
That's a great piece,
and so, you know, that's clearly a totally different style than like what Beethoven is. For my class, Janacek is like a 20th century composer, kind of. We'll get to him later. Anyway, the what you need to sort of play the Janacek piece versus what you need to play the Beethoven piece, like in a mental capacity, to me, I feel like it has to be different, like you can't go into like, even from like Beethoven to Mozart, right? Like you were just talking a little bit about how like you need like a lighter touch to play Mozart,
Right.
I feel like you can't go into these pieces with the same sort of expectation of like each different composer,
No, definitely not. Yeah.
So I guess whenever you're going in to like perform, say a Beethoven piece versus a Mozart piece, right? What are some of the differences and characteristics that you would be aware of as a performer
Between Beethoven and Mozart?
Yeah.
So, well, the main thing is the way you would read the music, even when you're just learning it. So Beethoven was very specific in the sort of the way he marked his scores, like the dynamic indications, accents, forzandos, like all that kind of stuff. And he was very specific because he was breaking away from the normal way of doing it, right? So they happen in really unexpected places. And if you didn't have those markings, you would play it in a very different way than what he wanted. So when you're reading a Beethoven score, you're like looking really, really carefully for all of these little markings, like a little staccato at the end of a slur is going to be of a lot more import than if you saw it in a Mozart score.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Mozart or Haydn. So that's, just reading the score is different.
Sure.
And then, you sort of do your research about what was happening in Beethoven's life versus Mozart's life when they wrote these two particular pieces. So like when I was working on this A-flat major sonata, it was really important to me to know that this was his second last sonata. This was after he's, gone through writing those letters. He's like decided he's going to live for music. And because of that, like, and also he's, developing a renewed interest in the works of Bach and fugue in particular. Yeah. This is, that all of his last sonatas, his last few string quartets, the last symphony, they all have fugues and big fugues, growth fugue and all that kind of stuff. And having that kind of knowledge, like I would not be able to put into words why knowing that would affect my playing, but it just does, because the fugue then has so much more gravity.
Right. It's like you can channel like just a different type of just energy into that piece,
Yeah, because I know it's not just a compositional exercise that he's trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
He really he believes so much in the power of the fugue and like has and it's so different than Bach's fugue, but it still works.
How I guess how would a Beethoven fugue differ from a Bach fugue? Just
first of all, just the size is completely different.
Right.
And then Bach had all of these, the original way of writing the fugue. There are a lot of rules. Beethoven is not following the rules of like invertible counterpoint and things like that, the way Bach created them, but at the same time, it just somehow works. And there's a certain gravity to it that I think, it completely sets them apart. And just the idea that he's going back, 100 years to this contrapuntal writing, which is completely overlooked during the classical period.
Right.
And, Bach has strong connotations of spirituality, and I think that's what Beethoven's doing at the end of his life. So just having all of this background is good. I'm going to play it completely differently than if I'm playing a sonata at the end of Mozart's life. Like he's going through like financial issues and health issues, but it's not this like war between Beethoven the man and Beethoven the god kind of thing,
right. I see what you mean. Yeah. Oh man. So do you view Beethoven as the end of the classical or the beginning of the romantic?
He is both. I mean, I think the beginning of his life is definitely the end of the classical period, and by the end of his life, he's fully in the romantic.
Right.
For me, he straddles
both eras.
Yeah. More than any other composer.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely can agree with that. I don't know. I've always struggled with Beethoven's music because, like, I find it extremely interesting, and it's the very first time I ever heard it, I was blown away. I remember the first time I played this is the Eroica Symphony. Man, just like as a bassist, like the amount of power that we as a section were able to like achieve in that piece was like insane, you know. And that was just his third symphony, and
Right.
like, but like playing it and listening to it are completely different things for me, you know. Again, like I would have to be in a very specific mindset to do that kind of work again. And like honestly, playing that piece, like that's work, you know. It's not like, I mean, it's fun, yes, I can't deny that, right? But it's like you have to put in some time, you know. There are just some things that, like, at least for me, like especially I was like learning my instrument still and trying to just fight my way through it, you know. And at the end of the piece, just feeling like you accomplished something. That was the coolest thing about playing Beethoven's works, was like this feeling of accomplishment at the end of it, you know.
Well, and that's so characteristic of, you know, his compositional style, this like struggle to triumph you find in most of his stuff. And you know, at this time the instrumentation of the symphony orchestra is changing, right? And you know, the horns are being given a lot more importance, the bass is being given a lot more importance. So now it's not just, you know, the way it was in Haydn and Mozart, is more like, you know, beautiful melody, the flute,
nice little colors in the background,
and you know, the lower strings are kind of accompanying. It's very melody plus accompaniment driven. And with Beethoven, like that boundary kind of starts blurring, and he's using all instruments in different ways. So that's why, you know, his symphonies really, there's an anxiety of influence for every composer after him who tries to write a symphony. They have to battle with, am I going to be able to produce something worthwhile after Beethoven?
Right. You know, and it kind of becomes this like weird one-upmanship in a way, you know, like all these composers, especially in the Romantic era, it's almost like they're trying to just like, well, how crazy can I get with my music, you know?
Right.
Like,
how much longer can I get? I mean, that's the first thing, you know, that happens.
Oh man, until like you're at the end of it and you have these like 16-day operas,
like, then Bruckner symphonies that just like, it feels
they never end, and like, okay, you know. And I think that sort of like stereotype of this music has created like a stigma of, you know, just classical music in general. And it's like, you know, whenever my students, at least, they all have to do a concert review, although, you know, we're kind of revising that at this point. But normally they have to like go out and like go to a concert, you know. And every semester they're always like, I have to go and sit for like an hour or 2 hours at a symphony concert. And it's like, yes, it's not going to kill you, man. It's like, it's the length of like a Marvel movie, you know, like you can go do it, man. And about half of them are always like, I'm really glad I did that. That was really cool. And, you know, the other half, they fell asleep. They're the ones that fail the class anyway. So, but it's always like fascinating to see like who kind of relates to that in a way. And like I've seen students from just all walks of life, and like randomly some of them are just, you know, I never would have expected that they were the ones that like got into it, and they're just like really into it, you know. It's really interesting.
I mean, I gotta say, like, I dread going to, you know, an orchestra concert sometimes if, you know, if I'm not in the right mood, and it's just, you know, something I bought tickets for a while ago, and that evening I'm just like not quite feeling it. It's a commitment, and I think that's what's so different, right, about like classical music, as opposed to the other kinds of music we listen to today, which is like a 3, 4, 5 minute song, you know, max. And here you're committing to sitting down and listening to like maybe 30 or 40 minutes. And it's hard to do. It's hard for classical musicians who understand the music to do, you know. But I think, and you know, it's okay to tune out for a little while, you know, like take a mental break in the middle. It's okay. But I think what keeps me coming back to classical music is like knowing the historical context of how it was created. And I've just seen so many examples, like, as you say, of people who you would never think would gravitate to that kind of music or find something in it. And I've seen that happen at so many of my concerts. Like when I played the Janacek Sonata too, like it's a piece that requires a little bit of like, I don't know, it's so sparse in a way that there's not much to hold on to. and you really have to accept, you know, the situation and like be open to what it's trying to do for you. But I've just had so many people come up to me and say after I've performed it that they found something so hollow, and you know, it helps people process their emotions.
Yeah, yeah. That's
So
one of the that's one of the cool things about music in general, you know. It's like it just it grabs everybody in a completely different way, you know. And like I one like the mantra of my class at this point is like music makes you feel, you know. And like
it does.
That
absolutely,
I think is just one of the most beautiful aspects about this thing, you know, because it's like it's that stuff that gives you like all like the little goosebumps on your arm, you know, or like those like tingly feelings. That it's just it's amazing, man. Like I look forward to that stuff now, and unfortunately it's like very rare that like I find those moments anymore, you know. But like whenever they do happen, man, it's just I love it. I love it so much.
And you have to sort of be open.
Yeah,
to it, right. You gotta like tune out the like quick little superfluous distractions.
Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah, it can be really hard to do.
Yeah. So I guess kind of segueing from that, you know, what is it about music that actually kind of like grabs you? You know, like what is it about music that makes you want to keep doing it?
Well, to me, I think the best thing about music is the sort of community connection that you can create with it, right? Like, music was never meant to be something that someone just did alone. Like, I can sit in a room and, you know, play the piano, and I do that for several hours a day to practice.
Right.
But that's not the point of it, right? The point is to eventually go out and play it for people. And for those moments that you're playing music, either by yourself for other people or in a group, a band or orchestra, whatever, you're creating the sense of shared attention to something that you're making together, right? And I think that's how music evolved. You know, it evolved as this thing of like a community activity where people made sound together, like whether it was rhythm or pitch, people did it together. And you know, all cultures have some sort of music, whether it's, you know, art music the way Western culture has it, or if it's like a religious activity, it's all based on community. And that's what keeps me coming back to it. The fact that I can connect with people who I may have nothing else in common with. I love that about music. Like, I can walk into a room and play with a musician from a different country who speaks a different language, but we have this like common shared interest in sound.
I just
think that's so cool.
You know, that to I guess get like a little more deeper into that concept, a little one of the things I think that interests me so much about like that aspect of it, of playing with other people, is that not only are you playing with other people, right, but you are all sharing the same sort of space and time, you know. And like there's something about like being in that moment, and whether by yourself or with a group, it's like you're all sort of expressing this one singular idea, you know. And especially when an audience can connect to that, it's just this magical moment, you know. And like it's almost like nothing else in the world matters, you know. And just there's this singular thing happening where everyone in this room is like experiencing this one thing, you know.
And as a performer, like, I can really feel that, you know. I've been in situations where I can sense that the audience is not fully locked into what I'm doing, and the goal is always to make them fully locked in. And that feeling when you're all like, it's like you're breathing together. Exactly. It's an amazing feeling. I mean, it's such a high. And even when you're playing with other musicians, like the way you all breathe together to even just come in together, it's like I don't feel closer to people than, you know, when I'm making music with them.
I completely understand that, man. It's something about like sharing that, just that pulse or something, you know. Like to me it's all about this pulse, you know, because like, you know, so in the church, you know, like that style of music that we play, it's very pulse driven, right? And like once that is sort of set, I always get lost in this sort of like this hypnosis kind of thing, you know, like that's all that kind of matters is that
right,
that pulse. Yeah, exactly. And you just fit inside of that, you know?
Right.
And whenever the audience or congregation, whoever you're playing for, whenever they can connect with that pulse, you know, and like everyone is kind of feeling the same motions, the same movement, you know, it's just, regardless of the setting that you're in, it's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and it doesn't, I mean, that's the thing that I love about music. It doesn't have to be a concert hall. It doesn't have to be,
right.
you know, any specific place. It can happen anywhere.
Yeah, right. But yeah, that's kind of like all the questions that I sort of had written down. Is there anything else that you kind of want to say or talk about?
Oh man, I think we covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah, no, we definitely have.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, it was fun.
Okay. Well, thanks for anybody who was watching, my class especially, because you had to watch. Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and stop this now. All right. And